requires and has to approximate omniscience. It has to approximate absolute total knowledge. And I'm not going to lie, there is for the opposition, the one point that, and I'll give the opposition some ammo, because it will just make the argument that much more interesting. The one point of opposition that has probably the most tenacity is the idea that state power lends itself towards omniscience. Any unknown is a potential threat, and thus everything should be, must be known, more strongly must be, deontologically. Everything must be known by the state. But you can imagine what that does with respect to civil liberties, what that does with respect to privacy, what that does with respect to everything if the state has to know everything. It's a very, very fine line that you have to walk, and there are tremendous examples in terms of oppositional responses that need to be addressed, where the state's desire and hunger and quest for increasingly more knowledge ultimately undermined the power of the state. The state ended up collapsing itself because it violated rights in the process of attaining omniscience. So it's a very delicate balance, and and this is why I feel what I'm doing is important, because a lot of this sounds easy now, but this is it's not easy to put this stuff together, right? This comes as a product of, I mean, since '02. This comes like 12 years worth of conceptualizing the fact. And what we really need, and it can even get better, is sort of historical evidence to talk about all of these specific instances. So even historians and the next generation of historians should come into the discourse to talk about how state power was compromised by overextending its reach in terms of knowledge, not in terms of military might. That's obvious. State undermines itself because it's overextended itself in terms of knowledge, I mean, in terms of military prowess. They bankrupt the nation because of that. They destroy too much because of that. It'd be interesting to see the relationship between sovereignty and the power in sovereignty and its relationship to intelligence. And obviously, you know, not atrocities is absolutely the wrong word, but what would be the word? I'm thinking about Watergate, but I don't know how to describe that. Intelligence are sort of breaches in etiquette because of a desire for more knowledge can cripple the state, right? So it'd be interesting to see sort of a historical formalized study that, you know, an emerging historian might put together to account for the relationship between the state and knowledge. For me, that would be I would love to read that. It'd be a treasure trove of factual information. But that's the point, right? The idea is to invite everybody, all scholars, into the discussion so that we have many, many different perspectives, of which my theoretical perspective will just be one. Okay, so bottom of page 10 then. For example, the use of technical collection makes sense in targeting states, but it is not nearly as helpful against non-state actors that do not have significant, easily identifiable territorial bases. This might be different a little bit now, but the idea is you're not going to mobilize an entire satellite for the identification of one individual, right? You're not going to mobilize satellite technology to find out if John's in the house or not, unless John is a really important target. Why? Because that directive, right, that objective is better suited for non-state actors, right? It's the non-state actors that require, and this is to a large extent true. I can think of a few caveats, but to a large extent this makes sense, right? When we talk about tech-int, when we talk about sig-int, obviously, we're not talking about the mobilization of those intelligence collections processes for the identification of individual state actors. No, you use that for the identification, hopefully, of the intent of the state. The state must have the intent to do X because our SIGINT is telling us that they are activating Y technology. Why are they activating Y technology? We don't know yet, but we can infer that since they're activating Y technology as verified scientifically by SIGINT, we assume that their intent is to do X. That might be a little bit technical for most people. For those of you who understand, shout out to you. For those of you that don't understand, I apologize. So that's the idea, right? The idea is to try and make sense of intentionality. We're talking about threats. So that the idea is we're trying to make sense of intent. You can't do this. You can't play this game if you don't know how to do intent. You really cannot play this game. The threat assessment is an assessment of the intent of individual state actors, collective groupings, cells, and sovereign nations, right? So having an understanding of, as I said earlier in the series, sort of the inferential means with which we come to understand intent, identify intent, infer intent is super important. Okay, last line on page 10. Scholars are currently trying to illuminate the link between knowledge and power. And that's awesome, right? Which is what I'm just saying. I would need historians to write that book. Like, I really want that resource. I don't have the training or the patience to do that type of research. It would require a ridiculous amount of sort of work, but it would be, I would think, canonical, historical work, right? Here's a direct quote from the book. They're telling you what they need. Scholars are currently trying to, quote unquote, illuminate the link between knowledge and power. What is the connection? What is the connection between the knowledge that we have and the power? And as I said, and this is why I go back and watch my own stuff, because despite the fact that I have notes, a lot of this is freestyle. It's like me just pulling information out of the ether. But the goal of the state must be the attempt to approximate omniscience with the recognition that if it attains omniscience, it undermines state power. It's a catch-22. So that there has to be a recognition that the goal is complete knowledge, with the recognition that if we attain that goal, we undermine complete knowledge. This is Nietzschean. So we have to create a threshold at which we recognize that knowledge saturation is good enough. The knowledge that we have right now is good enough to stabilize to the best of our ability, and we go with that. Because if you cross, and you would have to identify what that threshold might be, I would argue it's civil liberties and privacy, maybe. Less privacy now in a contemporary sense, more civil liberties, right? But where knowledge interrupts or interferes with civil liberties, there's a greater systemic threat to power. Privacy, less so. Civil liberties, more so. So I could already, without even really rigorously thinking about this, make a demarcation between the role of power and knowledge, because I am going to have to interfere with civil liberties in order to get more information on suspected targets and cells and networks and intent. But you can conceptually demarcate privacy from civil liberties. You can. And insofar as you make that distinction, you might be able to legitimize one and maybe not the other. So there are ways around that. All right, top of page 11. My goodness, time is going by. So here's an example. Quote, spies help a sovereign to help shift uncertainty into risk. Spies help a sovereign to help shift uncertainty into risk. I like consistency in terminology, and immediately I want to see a consistency between uncertainty and mystery, the term mystery, but the term mystery isn't used, the term uncertainty is. Obviously, mystery is more opaque than an uncertainty. An uncertainty is really nothing more than a secret, so it's another way of using the word secret, and we already know that secrecy can be exposed. It would have been interesting to see a conceptual formulation of the role of espionage or spies in terms of uncovering mysteries. That would have been interesting. Not to say that this isn't interesting, but it's already consistent. It's just a different use in terminology, and I would have. I just leave it at that. It's just a different use of terminology. Uncertainty instead of secret, or mystery rather. So spies help a sovereign to help shift uncertainty into risk, and that's clear. The assumption being it is easier to manage risk than it is to analyze and manage threat. Right? External threat is difficult to manage. Why? Because the intent of the individual is what you're really attempting